I was born and raised active LDS, just to let you know a little bit more about me. And I came to faith in Jesus in my college years and been a pastor and church planter in Utah since 1983. Recently, as Eric mentioned, retired from Alpine Church, but I'm still involved in stuff. And I still contribute to the podcast at pursuegod.org called Unveiling Mormonism. I have this regional ministry called Utah Advanced Ministries that I've scaled back, but I'm not shutting it down. And I'm in the middle of a current project is to create a curriculum for churches to be able to unfold and to disciple people who are leaving the LDS Church. So churches know what to do with that audience. So my interest in today's topic was that my graduate theological studies at seminary were focused on preparing to serve the church cross-culturally. In other words, I was planning to go on the mission field. And so my Master of Divinity degree has a specialization in missions. Now, instead of leading me to another part of the world, across the water somewhere, God clearly led me to return to Utah. We were praying about where do we go? Where do we put this into practice? And I was born in Salt Lake City, grew up in California, but God said, how about if you go back to your people? And so I've sought over the years to put into practice the principles that I learned in the missions department curriculum, to put them into practice here in this unique culture. And so I want to reflect on how to do ministry as missionaries in the unique culture of Utah. If I was a missionary sent to Thailand or Bosnia or Japan, then I would take into consideration and how would I go about sharing the gospel in this culture? How would I go about forming the church in this culture? And that's the subject of missiology, and I think it applies to the unique culture of Utah / Mormonism as well. So let me give you an idea of what missiology is. Okay, it's like a 25-cent word that people don't use unless you studied it in college, in graduate school. But missiology is the formal study using multiple academic disciplines, develop strategies for making disciples across cultural boundaries. And so it's a study of how to intelligently articulate the gospel and its life-changing power in a culturally appropriate manner. And so, in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, for example, Jesus said, and his final words to his followers, he said, you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. Well, he named a variety of different cultures. Each of those cultures, the culture in Jerusalem was different from Samaria. And the ends of the earth has added some cultural elements as well. And so, all different. Now, the gospel itself is transcultural. The gospel itself is not bound or defined by any particular given culture, but I believe that it's experienced and lived out in specific cultural settings. And so how people think about truth, about reality, about spiritual things, how they communicate is different in Jerusalem versus Japan or in America, right? And so a missiologist is somebody whose primary work is to study the way Christianity spreads across cultures. And the study of that then has its application as we choose to figure out how to communicate and how to do the work in a given culture. So my contention is that Mormonism is a unique culture. We all know that, especially if you're from out of state and you came in, you go like, oh my gosh, you have some culture shock you're going. Like, what are these people doing? What does oh my heck mean? Whatever it might be. Of course, culture includes worldview. It includes beliefs, but it's much more than that. And so I think historically, ministry, in an American context, we think a lot about ministry in terms of world beliefs, a worldview and beliefs. And that's really important. That's the crux of the gospel is tied up in the ideas that are represented in the Bible teaches. But culture also takes shape in many different ways. Unless we think about the larger picture of culture, which I'll define more in a minute, then I think there's a chance that we're going to miss the mark in our ministry, in our communication. That's why I was really encouraged when I saw in the email the other day that UC, the Christian Research Center in MRM, in the class that Eric mentioned that starts, the Introducing Mormonism, starts next January and February, that there's a segment in that course called Understanding the Culture of Mormonism and Ways to Share Your Christian Faith. So that was affirming. And so I want to talk for a minute about what is culture. What am I talking about? Well, culture is the entire human-made environment in which people live. Everything that, and we take it for granted. We don't think about the culture that we live in. It's not taught formally, it's imbibed. But it's the norms, the values, the customs, the traditions, the habits, the life skills, the knowledge, the beliefs, the way of life of a group of people. It's shared. It's complex. Culture is complex. Culture is always changing. Culture is porous. What I mean by that is that it's you're going to see it bleed into other cultures and receive from other cultures. There's no rigid boundary between cultures. There's cultural sharing that takes place all the time. And culture is overlapping in the sense that there's many subcultures. In America, there's a lot of subcultures. Mormonism is a subculture of American culture in some ways because LDS people all watch the same TV shows and listen to the same music as everybody in America, right? But there's something unique, distinct elements of Mormonism. And so the purpose of culture, and again, nobody thinks about it, but the role that culture plays in everybody's life is that it imposes meaning on the world. It makes the world understandable. And so we can communicate, because we share that. We can make sense out of reality because our culture tells us how to do that. Now, culture is not always right, of course, but it provides for us a template to understand the world that we live in, right, and to make it work. And so culture is learned subconsciously from the society around us. We call that enculturation, where you imbibe the culture. And you get enculturated even if you move to a different culture. It takes time. There'll be culture shock. There'll be things you hang on to. Immigrant cultures in America hang on to their original cultures in a lot of ways, but they have also been enculturated. If you move to the South, you might develop an accent after a while, or you might start to, develop attitudes that's enculturation that's happening. And culture is shared among a variety of people. So let's talk about some core aspects of missiology. So understanding culture a little bit, then how do we apply this discipline of learning about culture to the gospel? And so missiologists consider understanding that's based on a variety of disciplines, academic disciplines. It's an interdisciplinary process. One of those disciplines, the one that we start with that drives everything else, is biblical exegesis and theology. So the starting point for missional practices for us is the Word of God. It provides the basis for the practice of missions, the whole idea of missions, because God is a sending God. God is a missional sender. Jesus gave the Great Commission. He says, go to all the nations, as I mentioned earlier. But biblical theology and exegesis defines the nature of salvation, defines the nature of the message. What is the Bible saying that the message is that we have for people? It defines the nature of the church. What is it that we want to see happen? What is it that we want to expand? And so the Bible also has many principles and examples of how to do it. It's our starting point. For example, the number one probably example biblically is the incarnation of Jesus, where Jesus chose to become embedded in a foreign culture, you could say. He left behind the culture of the Trinity, was born into the world, into human culture, and for the purpose of connecting with and reaching people, inviting them into a relationship with God. You also have the practices of the apostles. We look at how Paul did it. We look at how the apostles did it and learn some things. There's some principles that are embedded in there that we can learn. Okay, let's figure out how what Paul did, it makes sense. How does it apply in our situation today? And so number one, the missiology starts with biblical exegesis and theology. But then it also involves the discipline of history, the history of missions. What have we learned over time? What have we learned in practice historically from how they did it back in the 1800s or earlier, and what they got right, what they got wrong? Also, much broader than that is the history of the church. Understanding the history of the advance of Christianity. Why has the church advanced in certain situations? Why has it contracted in other situations? We're looking at history to understand the expansion of the church. And then I think then that applies here. What can we learn from the history of the church's mission and ministry in Utah? As we apply missiology to our own setting here, so let's think about the history of what Christians have done in Utah, and what can we learn from that? So I appreciate, so Aaron has done some things recently about the history of ministry in Utah. And he's highlighted some of the Presbyterians in particular who came out in the late 1800s and established schools, education, because there was no education in Utah. And so what can we learn from that history? What did they get right? How would that look in our situation today, where everybody has schools available? And so one of the things in the church where I serve, that we said one way to apply that would be to start a preschool, because that's a felt need. So education was a felt need in Utah in late 1800s. So we're going to come in and we'll become credible, that they said, by creating schools and inviting parents to send their students. So we said, well, how can we learn from that? Well, we can apply that, I think we said, with opening a preschool, because that's a felt need with large families of young children. And we can gain credibility, and we can create relationship by inviting our LDS neighbors to send their kids here. So history is an important piece of it. Another discipline that missiology employs is anthropology. Anthropology is a study of the nature of human beings. Cultural anthropology studies theories of human culture, how people do culture, how they live it out. And so it helps us to identify elements that give coherence to a society, to a culture. Things like ritual and symbolism and social organization and gender status and gender roles. Material culture means the things that people build and create, architecture, crafts, and so artwork, so forth. And then, of course, worldview. And so missiologists think about then how the salient cultural features of a given situation, how do those impact faith conversion? How do they impact discipleship? How do they impact church growth? How do they impact leadership and ultimately the Christian life? For example, we want to look at a culture and say, how do they define what is humanity's basic problem? And so that helps us understand what's a way into the gospel. How does that culture determine how is truth ultimately known? A question of epistemology. And so we bring in our culture, we say, well, I know how truth is known. Well, that might not be how the people I want to share the gospel with think about how truth is known. So I want to do some culture evaluation. Anthropology helps me with that. And then, of course, lots of other disciplines. Communication theory, how does a culture discuss and share key ideas? Education, how do people learn? Who has access to it? Social science, how are social structures organized? Political science, what's the system of politics? Who's in control? So these are the kind of things that missiology is seeking to give us wisdom about in order to appropriately share the gospel, the unchanging gospel. So let's get more specific. With that, that's the overview I wanted to give you. But there's two particular issues that I want to get into today. One of them, the first key question, actually two, and if we have time, there's a third, a short one. Key questions raised. Number one is the question of contextualization. So how does the gospel message make sense in a given receptor culture? The gospel, again, is timeless, it's transcultural, it's not culture bound in any way. But I believe how the gospel is communicated varies based on the cultural context. So contextualization is how to present the unchanging truths of the gospel in a way that's intelligible within the unique and changing context of a particular culture and worldview. So how do we communicate in a way that makes sense to these people and sounds like good news to them? So again, the gospel is universal, but I believe that how it's communicated is adaptable. Of course, there's limits to that, but within limits it's adaptable. And I think Jesus himself, again, is the model. In the incarnation, he left behind the culture of the Trinity to adapt to human life on earth, right? In a particular cultural setting. We'll see the example of Paul as well. Paul, in the book of Acts, exemplified this contextualization because he used different approaches to share the gospel with different audiences, different cultural audiences. So in Acts chapter 13, he's speaking in Antioch of Pisidia. He's speaking to a Jewish audience. He goes into the synagogue, and he started with the Jewish scriptures. He started with the fulfillment of Jesus' prophecies, and then that led him to be able to share the person of Jesus and the gospel surrounding the person of Jesus. But then in Acts chapter 14, he in Lystra, he talks to an unsophisticated rural pagan audience. So with that audience, he started with the Creator's general goodness to everybody. He says, there's a God out there. He's given us all rain. He's given a sun to make the crops grow. And so now he's interrupted by a group of persecutors who came from a previous city. But his point was that he began with something those people would understand. Okay. He did not begin with the Jewish scriptures or the messianic prophecies of Jesus. They would have made no sense to them. They wouldn't have understood those things at all. And then when you get to Acts chapter 17 in Athens, where he's talking to sophisticated urban pagans, he began with the philosophical belief in an unknown God. He says, let me tell you who this unknown God is. And in each case, he communicated in a way that's appropriate to the thinking of those people. Again, he didn't try to discuss the Jewish scriptures with the Athens audience, but he sought to find common ground with that particular audience, but he always took the message toward Jesus and always toward the resurrection. So the work of Jesus and who he was and what God had done through him. And so that's the picture then of contextualization. How do we think about, and we'll go in a minute, we'll do a little bit of an overview of Utah culture and think about how the gospel maybe speaks to certain aspects of that. And so, but first of all, the method of contextualization then, how to do it, it involves analyzing the culture, the worldview, the beliefs, the practices, discerning how people in that culture tend to think about and approach God. What are their core aspirations? What are their felt needs? How do they validate or appropriate truth? How do they make spiritual decisions? Things like that. And then framing the timeless truths in a way that speaks to the people who possess those norms. Okay. Now, if you take it too far, it becomes a thing we call syncretism. Syncretism is contextualization taken too far, where it becomes then a blending of different beliefs and values to create some kind of a new hybrid form of things. So you say, I want to accommodate the culture that I'm sharing the gospel in. I can accommodate it to the point where I've accepted ideas or blended in ideas, woven them into the gospel, and it becomes not the gospel at all. And so the new form diverges from biblical Christianity and its beliefs. An example of that would be Rastafarianism. Or it diverges from biblical Christianity in its values. I think American evangelicalism has syncretized the culture's infatuation with celebrity, or the culture's infatuation with money. Those are things that impinge on the gospel, maybe sully the gospel some. So let's talk about LDS culture and what contextualization might look like, and apply it to Mormonism. So Mormonism, again, more than just a church, more than a religious institution, I believe that you can define Mormonism as a complete way of life, a complete shared identity. It's not just people who believe certain things, even though belief is a big part of it. And the LDS identity does include worldview and beliefs, as I said, but Mormons are not just people who believe certain things, and we'll see in a minute that there's limits to what they all believe. But within generalities, every Latter-day Saint is unique. There's differences in personal beliefs. In fact, the joke is like you get 8 Latter-day Saints in a room and they have 10 different opinions about a particular theological issue. But there's regional differences. I grew up in Southern California, very different from Utah Mormonism in a lot of ways. There's generational differences. We see that's vividly demonstrated. People in my generation versus the postmodern generation of young people. There's differences, I believe, between converts and birthright saints in terms of their cultural experience. There's differences between temple Mormons and non-temple Mormons. It's almost like a church within a church for those who are temple worthy. But I've just to kind of scratch it, the idea here, to open it up a little bit, I've identified 10 common cultural traits of Latter-day Saints as a people. There's many, many more than this, of course. And as I mentioned, cultures are always changing. One of the challenges of ministry in Utah right now is the LDS culture is rapidly changing with generations. And that's one reason why I want to talk about this. But I think these 10 observations still stand, perhaps maybe in less extremely than they did when I was younger and all the rest. But all the more reason to think contextually. So 10 things. Latter-day Saints tend to have a high self-image of their culture. They believe they're the best people on earth. And that might be personal. There's certain arrogance among some, but they certainly believe it about their group. Missiology has pointed out that high self-image cultures are often resistant to the gospel because they don't see a need. And yet, at the same time, the flip side of that is that LDS really, really want to be accepted and validated by evangelicals. They want us to think, you're like us. So that's number one. Number two is they're strongly family-oriented. Much of this is not new to you, right? You've been around Utah much. But LDS put a premium on family life, put a premium on expressions of family unity. Family reunions are bigger here than anywhere. Because the family is actually the core unit of salvation. People only reach the highest level of salvation in families, not individually. So the core aspiration is to be united as a family forever. And so what's the strategy? Then I think in response to that, we value family too. It's a biblical value, but it's not an idol. It's not the ultimate value. We want to point them to the greater family that we have in Christ, maybe. A third trait, Mormonism promotes personal achievement. The core aspiration is to prepare in this life for eternal advancement. It fosters, kind of related to that. So you have LDS people who can accomplishing great things, right? It's the highest per capita percentage in America of any group with higher education. Business success and all the rest. So it fosters a perfectionistic lifestyle. LDS are trying to prove their worthiness for salvation, prove it to God, prove it to each other, because the highest salvation depends on keeping all the commandments. It's a demanding religion because of this, so you never know when you've done enough. And so this causes people stress. They stress about their worthiness before God, because God is a perfectionist. The idea of forgiveness from God seems unattainable. Living eternally with the Heavenly Father, few are expected to make it. And so we want to address the gospel as good news to each one of those felt needs. And share the unconditional grace of Jesus that makes us righteous in Him, while modeling that grace in how we live and how we interact. Another trait, the fifth one, is to understand truth through experience. Again, I mentioned epistemology earlier. Epistemology is the study of how we know what's valid or justifiable knowledge or truth. How do we know what's really valid truth? Well, Latter-day Saints validate truth claims through spiritual and emotional experiences. There's a certain element of whatever authorities say, but mainly personally, individually, it's through personal emotional experiences, where at the beginning, investigators are urged to pray about the truth of the Book of Mormon, and they expect to receive a warm feeling to prove it's true. I can give so many examples in life decisions of my family and my siblings that I've interacted with over the years of how this is the way they discern what's true, even about making an investment, or it's a lot of things that have gotten them in trouble, actually, but they want experiences that connect them to God. And so I think strategically, I don't want to attack this approach, but there is a role for experience in how God works in our lives. It's not primary, it's secondary to Scripture. But what I want to do is I want to create spiritual thirst by learning to wrap the truth in the language of experience. I want to learn to speak the language of experience, because this is the culture that we live in. For example, I can have a debate all day long with LDS neighbor, with missionaries, about whether God is an infinite spirit or whether He has a body. At the end of it, I want to eventually bring that to my experience. Say, you know what? The fact that God is present everywhere, not just His influence, but His very personal presence everywhere, that's such an encouragement to me, because I know that He's always right there for me or I know that when my kids, as my kids grow up, they're going to encounter a dangerous world. I know that God is always there with them. Or if we're talking about the Trinity, all day long, we can go around in circles, boom, boom, boom. God is one, God is three. But at the end of the day, I want to work the language of experience into that by saying, when I think about the infinite nature of God, who is so far beyond anything that I can comprehend. I'm a finite being. I can't comprehend an infinite being. But when I think about that and realize, that just makes me want to get on my face and my knees and worship Him. He's so much beyond me. So that's my experience is working. It's not just cognitive. It's not just intellectual. But I hopefully, by sharing my experience, I'm creating thirst. So a friend of mine used to minister in Utah among LDS people a lot back in the day. He talked about salting the oats. You can lead a horse to water, you can't make him drink, right? And some of us have practiced, our approach to evangelism has been to shove the hose in their throat and turn on the water full blast, which then they're not going to drink, right? So how do you make them drink? He said, well, I think I want to put salt in their oats. And how do I create spiritual thirst? And a big part of it is through my vibrant experience with God and what He's done in my life. So the sixth one, the LDS culture has a narrative approach to theology. What I mean by that is that Latter-day Saints understand and communicate doctrinal truth in terms of stories, not in terms of doctrinal statements. Now, most of our churches have a doctrinal statement, and if you want to be a member, you agree with it, right? Mormonism doesn't have anything functionally. They have no real statement of faith. Now, they have the articles of faith, but it doesn't act as a gate, guard the gate. And they don't enforce it. The articles of faith is not up to date, and so doctrine in Mormonism is embedded in 4 key stories. The story of the plan of salvation. So they talk about what's our relationship with God like? What's the human problem? It's all wrapped up into this story about, we we existed in the pre-existence. Then we came to the second estate, the mortal probation. And then we can go back and be with God someday. And they weave it, all of the truths about, or their ideas of truth about how that works, that relationship with God works, all woven into a story. The second one is the story of the Book of Mormon itself and the narratives of the Book of Mormon. The third key story is the story of the restoration of Christianity under Joseph Smith. Jesus' original church is restored. And that, a lot of theology embedded in that. For example, the whole idea about the nature of God is embedded in the first vision story, right? That God is separate from, God the Father and Jesus are separate individuals, and that God is an embodied, glorified embodied person. Where do we get that from? Well, we get it from this story. And then the fourth key story is the Exodus to Utah. Crossing the plains. This is where a number of things that shape the Mormon culture are embedded. So the point is that we need to think about narrative. So they want to have a past and a destiny as part of a great cosmic story. That's the felt need. So what I want to learn how to do is I want to share the gospel in terms of stories as much as I can. I want to start with God's great story. After all, the Bible is a story. The Bible is a narrative. It's not a systematic theology handbook. But I also want to connect my personal story and our corporate stories together with God's great story and find ways to tell the truth in narrative terms. Now, this doesn't mean I never go systematic theology. I never go like boom, boom, boom. This is what the Bible says. All right, but I want to appeal to the culture and to connect with their way of thinking to helpfully to make the gospel make sense, the lights to go on. I want to use narrative and experience as much as I can to convey the truth of the biblical propositions, right? Okay, another one. The practice of unique dietary restrictions. We all get this, right? Alcohol, tobacco, coffee are forbidden, and until recently, caffeine, but not anymore. Not in soft drinks anyway. So, in other words, I just don't want to, my strategy here is I don't want to violate cultural taboos. So, for example, I spent a summer as serving in Malaysia one year, and I learned what they taught us, that you don't point your feet at other people. Like you're leaning back in the chair, and my feet are out in front of me. You don't point your feet at other people. You don't touch anyone on the head. There's a certain culture about head and feet and about body proximity and all the rest. It would be offensive. I don't understand why, but that's their culture. I don't have to understand it. It is the way it is. Oh, and also, you don't eat anything with your left hand. That's because that's the hand that's used for personal hygiene. And it would be gross if you saw anybody go like, yeah, I won't fill in the blanks for you there, but. So what are the cultural taboos in Utah? So I believe personally, I'm free biblically to use alcohol without being drunk. That's the biblical boundary there. But it's not visible inside my fridge. It's not something I'm going to go out on the patio in front of my Mormon neighbors and have a cold one, because I'm not being hypocritical. I'm being thoughtful and sensitive about the taboos of the culture. Okay, that's why. I always said I'm not going to mow my lawn on Sunday, because I don't. I'm not going to mow my lawn without a shirt on. Well, there's other reasons why besides the cultural, but Things like that are cultural sensitivities. I want to be sensitive to. So because the next one is kind of related, there's a sensitivity in LDS culture to perceived persecution, easily offended by anything that is seen as an attack on their precious faith. They want to be respected and taken seriously. And so I'm going to try to be gentle and sensitive about offering a positive response that sounds like good news to them. Now, I have to be careful here because sometimes just telling the truth can be conveyed to them by them as persecution. Just simply disagreeing with them. And so I need to disagree with them. We need to have honesty in our conversation, but I don't want to do it in a way that gives offense, right? The gospel itself gives offense, but I don't want to be the one who is giving offense personally. They're fierce, related to that, another cultural trait, they're fiercely loyal to their church and its leaders. And so my strategy on it, I don't want to attack what they consider holy. In all my conversations I'm not going to lead with Joseph Smith, married young women, was a pedophile, all right, so or whatever. I'm not going to lead with the faults of Joseph Smith. No, I want to get there eventually and hopefully have a relationship with a person that's trusted enough that I could bring up Joseph Smith. Now I lead with that. Why? Because that's going to shut off conversation. It's just shut off communication. I will be attacking, in their view, what they consider holy. The temple, their leaders, the Book of Mormon. So I'm going to be careful about what I talk about and when I talk about it, right? I don't want to be derogatory or make humor at their expense. And then one final aspect of the culture, as we're doing missiology here in the LDS context, that being LDS is driven by activity, not theology. Many different personal perspectives on beliefs, as we said before. But what the LDS Church expects of their members, they don't expect theological conformity. You can go outside the box as long as you don't try to create a following. As long as you don't appear to be disloyal. What they want is loyalty and activity. So they're going to keep their people very, very busy. In fact, that's one of the things that makes it hard for us to share the gospel with them, is that they have very little time for non-LDS relationships. And so I want to connect in a relationship. It's going to be some work to do that because their life is full. So some thoughts about just kind of like, so we've touched on ways that we could contextualize the gospel witness. Some other thoughts, maybe thinking about this status and role, how people look at who has status, what's the role that people have, and how do you see that? Well, this makes me wonder about what's the role of ex-Mormons in the Utah culture. As one, I am one. Ex-Mormons are seen as apostates. Less so now than back when I was coming out. But also they also know a lot. They also have insider knowledge and so forth. So thinking about what's the role of ex-Mormons and how do we use the people, ex-LDS people. So I never identified in my conversations with LDS people, I never say I used to be a Mormon. Not right away. I'll say it later. I don't want to make them feel like I bait and switched them, but at the same time, I don't want them to write me off right away. Now, I might say my family, I might lead with I have a lot of family members who are LDS. And so I've thought about this, I've studied this. And then eventually it'll come out, oh yeah, it was a long time ago, but I left the church. The question is, another question in culture, what makes a messenger credible? Every culture has an idea of like, oh, this is what makes a person credible. So in American culture at large, if you're a celebrity, you're credible. In Utah culture, what does it makes it credible? And I think it's easier to answer what makes us not credible. And that is if we have a derogatory approach. And if we use false stereotypes. If we say things about Mormonism that we've heard out there somewhere, but that aren't really true, or maybe only or partly have a glimpse of the truth. This is like, I don't know how many of you remember the Godmakers movie. It said a lot of truth, but it said it in partial truth ways. I'm sorry, that's a reference that's probably before you were born. That makes me not credible. If they feel like you don't know what you're talking about, that's not what we believe, then that makes me not credible. Another question in culture is like how spiritual decisions are made. How do people in LDS culture, Utah culture, how do they make spiritual decisions? And this is why, again, this is changing, but this is why I felt like over the years we've had opportunities to have a big evangelistic speaker come in, and I've said, I don't think it's worth the money they're asking us to put up, because LDS people are not going to make spiritual decisions in a public event. They're not going to stand up publicly and raise their hand. They're going to make spiritual decisions very privately, in an intimate setting. Now again, I think that's changing some. Okay, and again, I'm 100% supportive of the harvest thing that's coming on November 16th, because I think that Greg Laurie is listening to input he's receiving from local pastors and people involved in ministry about how he will communicate the gospel. So again, those are some things about contextualization. And the other thing is, this is shorter, but another key issue in missiology is what we call indigenization. If contextualization is about how our witness of the gospel adapts to the receptor culture, how we communicate in a way that makes sense to the receptor culture, indigenization is a little bit different. It's how the church reflects the norms of culture. How are you going to create the church? Obviously, hopefully the ideal of evangelism is that church is created. People are connected to the body of Christ. And so churches are planted. So how does the church reflect to the culture in a positive way? The idea of an indigenous church is a church that's fully rooted in its cultural setting. It's not consistent, that doesn't consist primarily of outsiders. For a long time, when I first came to Utah, the church in Utah, by the church I don't mean the church with a capital C, the church that everybody talks about in Utah. I mean Jesus' church, the universal church that belongs to Christ. When I say the church, when I came to Utah back in the 80s, the church, the Christian church, was not very indigenous. It's made primarily of people who were sent here for work. And they were looking to get out as soon as they could. But over the last 30, 40 years, the church in Utah has become considerably indigenous. And where it's outsiders are not a majority anymore. So, when we're thinking about indigeneity, we understand the gospel stands in judgment of many different aspects of human culture. And so I think everything human culture produces can be contra the gospel, most likely because of human sin, but it could be neutral, I think, at times. And I think there's certain things that human culture could produce that could be compatible with the gospel to some extent, at least as far as it goes. So I want the gospel is going to have to be the final judge of how I look at culture and when I create the church. And the other thing to keep in mind that missionaries have missed considerably over the last couple hundred years is the ideal cultural referent is biblical culture, not American culture or European culture, or not any other human construct. So back in the day, missionaries would go to Africa, they'd, quote, civilize the people by making them dress like Europeans, because their culture of reference was not purely biblical. So how do we measure indigenization? 3 things. Number 1 are the church attenders, locals or outsiders? I mentioned this earlier. Are they from Utah? Do they intend to stay in Utah? Are they going to raise their kids in Utah? And this isn't necessarily are they former Mormons, but the bigger picture is, are they Utahns? and or are they on their way out? I think more and more we see the church in Utah is made up of Utahns. That's a good thing. That's indigenous. And then the second thing related to that is our church leaders, locals or are they outsiders? For example, where do the pastors of the majority of churches come from? Are they Utahns? There's an increasing number of pastors in Utah churches that are Utahns. And or did they come from the outside and hope it doesn't mean they're going to necessarily leave when an opening arises, but they're not part of the culture. They can learn the culture as a missionary would, but when you think about membership and leadership, the evidence is that the church in Utah is becoming indigenous. May not be fully there yet. That's a question I can't answer. But becoming. Now, historically, missiologists have used a model they call the three-self model to define indigeneity. Three things. Is the church self-governing? Is it controlled locally or from without? Is the church self-supporting? In other words, the tithes and offerings of the people, can it support the ministry? Or are they still dependent on resources from outside? And is it self-propagating? Will it reproduce itself? Is it planting new churches? Is it leading people to faith in Christ and so forth? Other people have added, is it self-theologizing? Is it self-functioning? And then an idea that's newer to me is the idea of gospel infrastructure, another way to measure indigeneity, but not on the basis of a particular church, but on the basis of the church overall. As the overall church developed to maturity in terms of there are translated scriptures, there's theological education available, there's discipleship resources, there's buildings, there's community connection, there's relevant literature that's culturally relevant, there's indigenous music and things that, in other words, has the church produced the infrastructure that supports itself. And that is also increasing in Utah for sure. So, how indigenization applies to LDS culture would be questions like, what do worship services in Utah, what should they look like, given the culture that we live in? And I know there's a couple of churches over the years that I've been familiar with that have said, we need to try to make our worship service feel like sacrament meeting. We're going to use a lot of hymns, and we're going to use a piano. And this is just and we're going to use a chorister who repeats everything in the same sorry rhythm. No, that's not. But what we're discovering, I think that was a good idea contextually. What we're discovering is that by the time people leave the LDS church, leave their ward, and are ready to try something else, they don't want it to feel like the ward, right? So there's a distancing that's taking place internally. So there's questions about then, so how do we do worship services? How do we conduct our worship services in ways that are intelligible to the person who's leaving? One of the things that has come up in often is that evangelical worship services feel immodest to the former Mormon, because everybody's wearing shorts and women don't have cap sleeves and whatever, etc. So that's the idea. So those are indigenous questions. Another one: how do we train disciples? How much do we borrow from LDS norms? Now I'm going to borrow their content for sure. But how do we take our content, biblical content, do we put it into LDS norms? For example, how do we use media? What's the role of personal relationship in discipleship? Those are questions. Those are questions that are good to be asked. How are churches governed? And so how do we think about how to make the church take shape appropriately so that it's still true to the biblical value and model, but it also makes sense in the culture that we live in. So one last thing I'll mention it really quickly: redemptive analogies. Are there ideas that exist in the receptor culture that mirror some aspect of the gospel? Is there some place that an analogy that mirrors some truth? The only example of this that I'm really aware of, that I've been more aware of thinking about lately, is I was exposed to this idea. I don't know why I didn't think of it for a long, because it's a great idea, but by Michael Flournoy, who's written a really good book recently. He's a former Mormon apologist, but he's pointed out to me that the biblical concept of imputation, that Jesus does for us what we cannot do for ourselves, and we accept his imputed righteousness by simply a decision to say yes to it. He says that's mirrored in proxy ordinances for the dead. You have somebody else who does something for you that you can't do, and all you have to do is say yes to it when you're in the spirit world, right? So he says he said, I think that helps us explain what we mean by imputation. So that's just an example of that. So we have a few minutes left. I want to see if, before we're all ready to go, I'll hang around for a while too afterwards, and we can talk about anything you want to. Happy to sign any of the books if you happen to buy my books, whatever. But let's take a minute while we're still together. Let's talk about any questions you might have, or any comments or feedback you might have, where you say, "Oh, I'm not sure you're right about that," or you say, "Oh, I see what you're saying," or "What about this?" Let's have a minute to discuss that. So, any thoughts? Yeah.
I think it's interesting, the historicity question. I mean, I know you mentioned missiology. Part of it is the history of the church. Part of it is understanding, like you said, the current historical context, because time is kind of what encapsulates any of the rest of all of that stuff. 50 years ago, the time made the difference to the gender roles, to the leisure time, to the all of that stuff, and I think that's kind of what makes it hard now, is that it's hard to like look around. It's easy to look and I mean, it's easier
to look
say
back
50 years ago, this is kind of what worked or what didn't. The harder thing now is to be like, well, what the heck, all bets are off, and what is the, because you're right, like what's going on this week? I don't know. So I
because it is changing.
Yeah, that's right. And so I kind of wonder, as you kind of address those things, how do you, across all of these? I mean, I'm making a bold statement here that temporally, it's just the mix of stuff is where it is now.
Yep.
How best do you take those things into consideration? I mean, one thing is, I guess, just to be aware of all of them in your current context, temporally where you are now. But what do you? What did you do with that comment? I guess.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's a great thought. It's very thoughtful. I mean, and it's definitely a consideration. And the way, because none of us is a objective, impartial observer. None of us is an omniscient observer. So we can look around and say, oh, and we can, I can look at things from my perspective. But so the way I try to figure that out is I want to talk to people. A lot of things about culture that have my sense of what the culture is like come out of conversations. And many of the conversations with Latter-day Saints are, in my case, I have more relationship with people who've recently left Mormonism. And so their perspective is going to be skewed a little bit, but at least they have some idea of like what it's like in the Word this last year, or any LDS culture. So I want to talk to people, but I also want to look at a lot of different sources. There's a lot of great sources that are out there. Blogs. There's a million different blogs out there with different perspectives on Mormonism. There's the progressive perspectives. There's faithful perspectives. There's the Mormon apologists and so forth. So I'm gonna sample a lot of that as much as I can and try to read it with discernment and try to put the pieces together. So that's my approach to saying, how do I get an accurate sense of what's going on in the moment, even though I'm also temporally bound with it too, and I'm also not objective. So I'm just going to try to now in your life, your ministry, whatever it might be, you may not have as much freedom as I might have to do all that, but I'm at least tuned in to the questions. And so when I see data that helps me understand it, even if I'm not reading a blog every day, whatever, then I'll have a framework to put it into. Yeah. So it's a great point. Yeah.
Can we discuss more the role of ex-Mormons? So I left a year and a half ago, and I'm really aware of the fact that I have no trust. So I can't go share my you talk about the narratives, right?
Yeah.
So you would think that they would be receptive to my story, but I think since they are partial narratives, they shut that right off. Nobody wants to know why you're gone. They want to invite you back, but they don't want to ask why you're gone.
Right.
So I realize, like, my heart's burning to share what I've learned so that they can see the Bible, but I don't have any credibility. So what is the role? Can I just support you guys in your role? And I want to say I'm so thankful for all the evangelicals and the street preaching and everything that's going on in Utah. I've been so impressed learning about this world I had no idea about before. But I'm so glad that Never Mormons are called to come and do this. Because they do have more credibility than I would have. Or I thought, like, when I do evangelize, am I supposed to hide that fact and not say I'm ex-Mormon? But that's in the future. So, like, what do I do now? How can I support this?
That's a great question. I remember, like, when I first came out, I had some antagonism like that. My brother would, especially I have one brother who was he goes, "What's wrong with your first baptism? Why did you get baptized again?" So there were conversations where they weren't necessarily fruitful conversations. He wasn't necessarily listening. He was challenging me. So I understand what you're saying. So in terms of narrative, is there a way? I mean, think about this. Because you may have opportunities. Is there a way to frame your narrative not around leaving the LDS Church,
Right, tell a different story.
but around coming into a real relationship with Jesus?
Yeah.
And so this is what, and can you, even in your narrative, can you, this maybe some people might disagree with me about this, but wherever there's something about Mormonism that is positive, I'm okay to acknowledge it. Okay, not the whole theology of families, but the family values and moral situation, or something about. Whatever I can acknowledge and say, I appreciate this about my LDS upbringing. I learned how to work hard. I learned how to sing 4-part harmony, whatever. But so the things that I want to communicate, the things that I appreciate, so people don't just construe me as being, I'm going to burn it all down. Right, but then the narrative becomes my narrative moving forward. My narrative, how I found Jesus. But not necessarily depending on the nature of the conversation, who you're talking to. Not necessarily about what I found was wrong with Mormonism. Right? Does that make any sense at all? Anybody else have any input for her on that?
Well,
Yeah.
I officially left 18 years ago, and in my neighborhood, no one has ever asked me why I left. And it's really just why. This disturbed me. There's the Rolex questions. I've sinned, or someone offended me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And have you had that?
Oh yeah.
It's mind-boggling. I mean, as a leadership and people, I don't understand why.
Well, they're not going to ask you why, like you said, because they know why, because of all the myths, right? But more than that, it's threatening to them. If they find out that you left and there is a reason why you left, then they don't want to go there because of the potential threat to their own testimony, right?
Well, another cultural thing I noticed, if you go into most Christian churches, there's always the coffee bar over here. And if you bring your active member in, it smells like a 7-Eleven, and you know that that's offensive to them, if they're really true believers. And anyway, I was able to never really succumb to coffee because I don't like it. My wife's another story. But I'm scarred from Mormonism because I don't like it.
Yeah, I don't drink coffee. After 40 years of being out in church, I don't drink coffee. Yeah.
So how do you navigate that in your church, in the Alpine? Do they have a coffee?
We have coffee, yeah. Because partly, we said we have very, very few true blue Mormons who are going to come through our doors ever. The most likely time that they'll come through, we found they will come to a child dedication. For the sake of their kids who they love, so want to have connection with them, and their kids have left the church, but so it's easy to spot them because they come in with a suit and tie, and they're the only ones wearing a tie, and she's wearing, the only one maybe wearing a long dress or whatever. But so yeah, we still do. Because we've said, that our audience, we're not going to, blow that person away by what we say. We want to create an environment where for the LDS person coming in, we're not going to stick too much of a stick in their eye. I mean, other than we have coffee, and we have loud music and drums and stuff like that. But our audience, Rob, is we really are intentionally trying to connect with the disaffected Mormon, and they're not offended by coffee. In fact, they might go, "Oh, nice," So yeah.
I meet a lot of Mormons, but it seems like the ones that I meet, the majority of them, it's more of a cultural thing.
Mm-hmm.
They're not really concerned about their belief systems as much as they are. It's like they're in a club, or their family, their
Mm-hmm.
ties, and they've never really heard the gospel before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so when I share the gospel, I don't get into their belief system, because they really don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, it varies.
And you don't know what they believe, right? Yeah.
Unless it's, they're hardcore, they know what they believe,
Mhm.
then that's a different subject.
Right.
But the majority of them don't even know what the gospel is.
Yeah.
When they hear that, it's really interesting how they react, And one of my intros is, I say, have you ever read the Bible? And they'll say, well, I read a little bit, so on. And then I'll use Jeremiah 23:6. I'll
Mhm.
say, well, I found this little phrase there at the end of the verse, and 4 little words, and I'll say, here it is, the Lord our righteousness.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll stop and just pause, and they usually what they'll say is, so what does that mean?
Yeah. Glad you asked.
And it just is intro to the gospel.
Yeah.
But I mean, so many of them are just tied into that what you're talking about,
Yeah.
the culture.
Yeah. Or it's an identity.
Yeah.
But they don't believe it.
They
Or they believe it because it's part of their culture, but they don't believe it at the depth of level that we'd say we believe our faith, and they don't understand or even know it. Yeah, this is a
and
great
the
observation.
Other thing is, I'll say, here's what I don't disagree, or I disagree with your, one of the basic concepts of your religion is that you believe we're all children of God. And they'll say, and that's like a whole different, they've never heard of that before.
Mm.
And I'll say, when Adam sinned, we were all created in the image of
Mhm.
God, but when Adam sinned, we all became children of the devil. And I'll say, to prove that, remember when Jesus said to the Pharisees,
Right.
you are of your father, the devil. And they, it's like, oh,
Right.
and to
Right.
prove that, Ephesians 2:1-3.
Right.
And then I'll say, that's why we have to be born again.
Yeah.
And that is like a whole crazy thing they've never heard of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks for sharing that. That's really helpful. Yeah. Here in the front.
Yeah, thing I'm dealing with, because I have family members who are in the LDS Church. I think the LDS Church and other belief systems really like having very unfalsifiable worldviews. And what I mean by that is it doesn't matter if you point to all this church history, all this theology, all this philosophy. You can go quote all these verses in the Bible. But if they're claimed that Joseph Smith really did receive revelation from God and Jesus Christ, none of that would matter. You're reading it all wrong, and you're just interpreting it all wrong.
Yeah.
So it just kind of hinges on, like, if you do believe Jesus Christ, I really appeared to Joseph Smith, like, then the rest of it doesn't matter. And to them, I think if you're presenting like the Nicene Creed or these other things, you know, Jesus didn't come down from the sky
And deliver
give
that,
to
yeah.
it. So it's like, well, Joseph Smith got revelation from God. That just seems like way better to them. It seems like a way better deal than how do we interpret this verse in the Bible, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. That's why there's important role for apologetics and what, you know, MRM is doing and others to say. Now, I don't lead with apologetics necessarily, but when it comes up, when those arguments are made, I want to be able to have a good answer. And so I use actually a book I use a lot is a book that that Bill and Eric wrote called Answering Mormons' Questions. It's great to have on the shelf and say, oh, let's talk about that thing about, Revelation. You know, look the chapter on it, and there's a biblical answer, as well as a response to the Mormon truth claims about it. So yeah, so we have to be, so I want to say, I want to be culturally informed about how I share my faith, but a key part of that is I'm not saying we don't engage in apologetics, and we need great apologetics tools when those kind of conversations, those questions come up. So a lot of LDS people, like you're saying, are not going to ever ask that question because they don't have the depth of the worldview. But when they do, I want to be able to say, well, have you thought about this? Or here's a challenge that maybe that doesn't make sense to me because of, X, Y, Z. So yeah, there's going to be a place for that for sure. And those are great resources that we have to have. But I can't give you an answer right away other than say, go look it up, in a setting like this. Yeah, back, in the back.
So, I have a number of ex-LDS friends, and they oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, as they leave the church, that church, they are shunned. And I have one friend right now whose daughter refuses to even talk to her, has disconnected completely. So can you help me know how to best minister to her? She's a believer now, and so that's great, but there's a lot of pain. There's so much pain that if it's all about family, then why are so many shunned when you simply change? In the Christian community, if you're Baptist one day and you want to become Methodist or Catholic, it's like, well, okay, we're going to love you anyway.
Depends on what Baptist church you go to, I guess, but
But it seems like in the LDS community, if you make a decision to do that, and it gets back to that apostasy mindset that's just apparently pounded in. And but how can we best support people who are grieving so much over this?
Well, just being there alongside is certainly huge. Now, this is in the materials that I'm producing a whole thing right now about how to help people as they leave Mormonism. This is in 2 chapters on relationships, 2 sessions, because we know it's such a big deal. One thing is I want to help them understand that the motives, the reasons why they're being shunned and so forth, they're not personal. The system has said their culture dictates this is the only way you know how to deal with somebody who leaves the church, and it's affirmed within the church, the cultural circles and church circles, and it's not because they don't love you, but because they're threatened by something that you've done. They're threatened maybe about they value they're concerned about their own testimony. They don't want their kids to go astray, and so grandma can't necessarily. And so I want them to understand the internal thinking and the emotional process that led that person to do that, so they can have some empathy for them and understand that it's not personal. Yeah.
I understand that now in the young women's group, even though that they are teaching these young people, just that there's a whole new program or push on to bring people who have left back. Come back.
Oh yeah.
We want you.
Yeah, we're going to treat you different, whatever. Yeah, as a result. Yeah.
I left the Mormon church about 9 years ago. I didn't really leave, I just migrated away. and I was pretty much spiritually dead for lots of years. But when I got thirsty again and started searching and found the true church, I was very offended, and it was odd that I was offended when somebody asked me, "Oh, when did you become Christian?" And for me, I always thought I was Christian. I always thought I believed in the same Jesus. You know, I believed that as a Mormon. And I was a convert, so I wasn't raised or whatever. I was always looking for that. How would you deal, what are your thoughts on that, and how would you approach somebody that, you know, thought they were, because that was offensive to me. I was like, I am Christian, I always was, but now I'm realizing as I'm learning that I wasn't. What's your thoughts on that?
Okay, couple of things. There's a whole we don't have time. I'll try to keep it brief to the point. Two things that come to mind. Number one is, I don't ever want to get into a debate with people about mere labels. Who's a Christian, who isn't. I want to talk about what do you mean when you say Christian? So when you say that I'm not, what do you mean by that? Can you explain to me what the idea of Christian means to you? I had this conversation with my eldest brother a lot, and he says, oh, once I understand what you mean by that, I don't want to be the kind of Christian you say that you believe in, you know. But I think with respect to then the individual experience, I think there are genuine Christians within the LDS Church. That's up to God. That's not up to me. Now, they certainly, it's unlikely that they believe standard Mormonism, because that would be really hard to come to personal faith in Jesus if you believe in a gospel of laws and ordinances. But I think that I know some people who began to discover Jesus in a real way within Mormonism. Eventually, it inevitably led them to leave Mormonism, because that's not the kind of Jesus that was depicted there, the kind of relationship with him was depicted there. So I don't want to say, you were LDS, so you're never a Christian. I want to explore, say, tell me about your faith. Tell me about your relationship with the church. Oh, what about your relationship with God? How did you think about that? How did you define that? So again, every individual cases are all over the map. There's no one standard case. And so I want to learn from, I don't know what you believe until you tell me what you believe. I don't know what your experience was or your heart for Jesus was until you tell me what that was like. And then I could say, oh, well, here's how I would think about that. Here's what the Bible says about that. And so, yeah, you're right about this and this, but here's something that I think I would want you to consider. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can I just make one final?
Yeah.
I know you gotta go,
Yeah.
but just to kind of comment on this, those conversations, and you have talked about your own conversations being a little fraught sometimes, right? Like, this is not easy. This is like some high level, sometimes can be some high level like relationship wrangling, and you know, sometimes theology, and not everybody is super comfortable with it all the time, and I'm not super comfortable with it all the time. And I'm dressed to, you know, you can tell I'm trained to be comfortable, but I think also to the question that Rob had earlier, I mean, sometimes people haven't heard this stuff and they don't know outside and inside the church. And so one of the things you brought up is discipling. Like, feel comfortable to bring them to your pastor, you know, to invite them to church. And I know that's sometimes a hard sell, but to say, you know, for them, they're not going to like wake up one day and they're going to be like trained, discipled Christians, you know. Part of it is not just that it's on you either as a personal friend to them. But you actually have the Christian church here to help you and to teach you and to bring them so that they can start having a life where it's not just them becoming unmoored from their previous life and floating freely, but actually to become anchored and to go to a place where the gospel is made, where it is proclaimed weekly, regularly, the life of the church is lived out there, and to fold them into something, not merely to detach them from something, because that's not going to help them either.
It's a great point. It's a great point. And on that point, that's a great way to close. And so, Eric, anything you want to say before?
Tell us real quick, I mentioned your books. Would you just once again tell us
about
the books you have? We'll sign afterward.
Happy to sign and talk to you about the books. There's 3 out there. One is called Understanding the Book of Mormon. And it's kind of a basic Sunday school approach for traditional Christians to say, what is that Mormon book all about? The second one is called Understanding Your Mormon Neighbor. And it's basically an ethnography of Mormonism, in a sense. It's dated a little bit now because they changed a couple of specific things in there, like the Sunday schedule that I talk about in there. But by and large, it's an approach to say, who are these people? Not just what they believe. That's a lot of great resources out there about what they believe, but who are they? How do their lives work? How do their relationships work? And what is it like to be a Mormon? And that's helpful to gain empathy. The third one is called Responding to the Mormon Missionary Message, and came out about 2 years ago. And we did, the co-author and I, Corey Miller, he's a former Mormon, I'm a former Mormon. We found 5 guys who are former Mormon missionaries who are now followers of Jesus. And we said we're going to have each one of them interact with one of the chapters in the Mormon missionary lessons. There's 5 Mormon missionary lessons in the Preach My Gospel curriculum that they use. So we had each one a former Mormon missionary who is now a credible, articulate Christian interacted. How would you handle this? Because we want to encourage people, Christians, we want to encourage Christians not to lock the door and turn out the lights when the Mormons come by, but to be willing to engage them, to be equipped to engage them. And so those are the 3 that are out there.